Okay, in this video we're going to look at how the government influence relative prices within the energy market in terms of how they use the carbon tax and subsidies to renewable energy providers to change relative prices, how they can use subsidies to increase employment, and how incentives can often lead to moral hazard amongst businesses. So the carbon tax. First of all, you need to know a couple of the key stats about the carbon tax and why it was a negative incentive. So first of all, the carbon tax was introduced in 2012 and it was a $23 tax per tonne of carbon emissions. So each producer, it was levied on producers, the top 500 biggest polluters in Australia had to pay a tax of $23 per tonne of carbon. The idea of that was to increase the price of carbon. The carbon tax was to increase the relative price of carbon-intensive production. So it cost businesses more to generate energy from fossil fuels relative to what it cost them to generate energy using less carbon-intensive products. So basically, it was costing them more. Their costs of production were increasing for things like using fossil fuels as opposed to using renewable energy sources like wind and solar. And as we know, when production costs increase, businesses' profits are likely to fall, and that's less of an incentive to shift resources to that area. So the carbon tax was an additional cost of production for carbon-intensive industries, and it provided greater incentive for them to reduce their CO2 emissions so that they can lower their production costs and remain competitive. The thing is that even though the tax was levied on producers, a lot of these additional costs were passed on to consumers. So if producers were to increase their prices when they had higher production costs, consumers started to switch to using more cheaper, lower emission alternatives. So because carbon now had a tax on it, it raised the price of carbon, and therefore it made things like wind and solar relatively cheaper. While their price had stayed relatively the same, it was now relatively cheaper than the carbon-based energy or energy from fossil fuels because those were more expensive. So the idea was, by changing the structure of relative prices, by increasing the price of carbon relative to solar, it helped to lower the amount of CO2 emissions because people substituted into using solar energy as well. So we talked about how businesses like to produce where they have a relative price is higher, but only if that relative price is higher because of increasing demand. In this case here, the relative price was higher because of their cost of production were higher, which actually increased the demand for the substitute, which in this case was wind and solar. Okay, what they can also do is, in order to lower the price of wind and solar and renewable energy sources, they also subsidise them as well. So they taxed carbon and they subsidised wind and solar energy, so it had that double effect. It increased the price of carbon and lowered the price of wind and solar to encourage people to use that in consumption instead of production. Government can also provide incentives to hire workers. So in the 2016-2017 budget, there was a program called the Youth Jobs Path Program, which basically involved 3 steps. And the whole idea of it was to reduce youth unemployment, because youth unemployment in Australia is double the rate of, the normal rate of unemployment. So youth unemployment's around 12%, where Australia's unemployment rates are hovering around 6% in total. So this program involved 3 steps. In stage 1 of the program, they provided 6 weeks of training for the youth. So they gave them 6 weeks of training to make them more job ready, to make them more employable. In stage 2, they gave businesses that hired these people for internships, so for like placements for a certain period of time, they got given an upfront payment of $10,000 if they hired anyone that was part of this program for 4 to 12 weeks. So the idea was, by subsidising businesses, it made it cheaper, and then provided an incentive to hire these younger workers in the workforce for a 4 to 12 week internship program. Then in stage 3 of the program, businesses offered the interns ongoing jobs, and those that did take on an intern long term, so not just for the internship but long term, were also given a wage subsidy of $6,500 to $10,000. So they got a subsidy for putting them through the internship program and another subsidy if they hired them on a long term basis. And the idea of this is to lower the cost structures for businesses hiring your young workers and encourage them to not only provide skills for young workers in the first stage, but increase the incentive for businesses to hire them in the long term. Government incentives can also lead to moral hazard. So, for example, and there's the idea of perverse incentives. So we talked about perverse incentives when you get car insurance, you might drive in a more risky fashion. Moral hazard can create perverse incentives for businesses as well, and we did mention this in class as well, but during the GFC, the Australian government guaranteed bank deposits to stop a potential bank run, which basically means that those who have savings in the bank, is where those who have savings in the bank can quickly get their cash out before the bank goes broke. But basically what they did is the government guaranteed that the banks would have enough money and they provide money to the banks in the case that they didn't have enough money to give people their savings back. And the problem with this is the banks knew that if they took on risky people, and they knew that if they took out risky loans that they'd still get bailed out. So the government unfortunately encouraged banks to take risks with their consumers, as they knew the government would bail them out if they came out. So people would deposit money into these banks, and the banks were doing risky things with them. They were lending them out to risky borrowers, and you talked about subprime borrowing. So the consumers thought their money was safe, but the banks were more risky with the money that they got from people's savings, because they knew that if they didn't have money to pay the people back, the government would bail them out and the people would get their money back anyway. So this led to poor investment decisions, which ultimately threatened the viability of the banking system. And as you know, that led to significantly increased borrowing, subprime borrowing, borrowing to people without income verification, and all this came about because the banks knew that they would get bailed out if they didn't have enough money to pay people. Thank you.